A stray dog's desperate barks led a man to an abandoned house in Detroit. What he discovered inside would change countless lives forever. It was a bitter, cold December evening when fate decided to test Mark Thompson's humanity. The howling wind carried more than just snowflakes through the deteriorating neighborhood. It carried the sound that would alter the course of many lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The streetlights cast eerie shadows across the snow-covered sidewalks of Highland Park, one of Detroit's most forgotten neighborhoods. Mark pulled his coat tighter as he hurried toward his car after another long shift at the local homeless shelter. At 42, he'd spent the last decade helping others rebuild their lives, but nothing could have prepared him for what this night had in store. That's when he heard it, a series of urgent, desperate barks cutting through the winter air. Most people would have hurried past, eager to escape the biting cold. But something about those barks seemed different. They weren't aggressive or territorial. They sounded almost pleading. Mark had always been known as the guy who couldn't turn away from anyone or anything in need. His small apartment already housed 3 rescued cats, much to his landlord's carefully concealed disapproval. His mother often joked that he had inherited his grandfather's heart, too big for his own good. But tonight, that big heart would lead him to something extraordinary. The barking grew more insistent as Mark followed the sound down Mason Street, past rows of abandoned houses that stood like silent sentinels of Detroit's struggling history. The dog, a scraggly German shepherd mix with intelligent eyes and a graying muzzle, appeared from behind a rusted gate. Instead of approaching Mark, she barked again and looked deliberately toward a dilapidated Victorian house at the end of the street. "Hey there, girl," Mark called softly, using the gentle voice he'd perfected over years of approaching scared, homeless individuals. "What's got you so worked up?" The dog's tail wagged slightly, just enough to show she wasn't afraid, but she continued barking and looking toward the house. Then she took a few steps in that direction, turned back to Mark, and barked again. The security guard in Mark told him to call animal control and head home. The social worker in him noticed the dog's deliberate behavior. This wasn't random barking. The human in him couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was very wrong. The house the dog seemed so fixated on had probably been beautiful once. Its Victorian architecture, though crumbling, hinted at more prosperous days. Now it stood dark and foreboding, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling like old scabs. The front yard was a tangle of overgrown bushes and weather-worn children's toys. A plastic tricycle lying on its side, a faded red wagon half buried in snow. Mark's phone showed 8:47 p.m. as he pulled out his flashlight. The dog had already trotted to the front porch, looking back expectantly. Years of working with the homeless had taught Mark to trust his instincts, but they'd also taught him to be cautious. He pulled out his phone and dialed his friend, Officer Sarah Martinez. "Sarah, yeah, I know I just left the shelter, but I've got a situation here." He described his location and the dog's behavior. "Something feels off. Would you mind swinging by?" Sarah, who'd worked closely with the shelter on numerous cases, knew Mark wasn't one for dramatic overreactions. "Give me 10 minutes. Don't go inside without me." Those 10 minutes felt like hours as Mark stood in the growing cold, watching. The dog paced anxiously between him and the house. He noticed things his initial glance had missed: fresh footprints in the snow leading to a side window, the faint glow of what might be candlelight from a second-floor window. The dog's behavior became more agitated when a muffled sound came from inside the house. Mark's heart stopped. It sounded like crying. Before he could process this, the dog squeezed through a gap under the porch and disappeared. Sarah's patrol car pulled up, lights off to avoid drawing attention. As she approached, her hand resting instinctively on her holster, the dog reappeared from under the porch. This time her barks were different, more urgent, more demanding. "I've called for backup," Sarah said quietly. "But if someone's in trouble, in there, we need to check now." She pulled out her flashlight and nodded to Mark. "Stay behind me." They found the side door unlocked, its frame splintered from an old break-in. The dog slipped in ahead of them, her nails clicking on the wooden floors. Their flashlight beams revealed a house that had once been a home. Faded wallpaper curled from the walls, family photos still hung askew. Dust-covered furniture stood like ghosts of domestic life. The dog led them through a kitchen where ancient dishes still sat in the sink, up a staircase that creaked beneath their feet, and toward a closed door at the end of the hallway. The crying sound was clearer now, accompanied by what sounded like whispered prayers. Sarah drew her weapon, nodding to Mark to stay back. But before she could announce their presence, the dog pushed through the partially open door. What they found inside would haunt Mark's dreams for years to come. The room was barely heated by a small camping stove, its fumes filling the space with a dangerous warmth. In the corner, huddled under what looked like every blanket and coat they could find, were 5 children. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12, the youngest perhaps 4. They were clustered around a woman who lay on a thin mattress, her breathing shallow, her face flushed with fever. The dog immediately went to the children, letting out a soft whine as she nuzzled the youngest, who wrapped his arms around her neck. "Shadow came back," he whispered. "And she brought help. Mama, just like you said she would." The story that unfolded over the next few hours was one of both heartbreak and hope. The woman, Maria Suarez, had fled an abusive relationship with her 5 children 2 weeks ago. With nowhere to go and local shelters full, they'd found refuge in the abandoned house. Shadow, the German Shepherd mix, had appeared 3 days ago, bringing them discarded food she'd found and keeping them warm at night. But Maria had developed pneumonia, too afraid to seek medical help for fear of her ex-husband finding them. The children had been surviving on what little food Shadow brought and what the oldest, Miguel, could safely scavenge. They'd been burning candles and running the camping stove sparingly, trying to ward off the December cold while avoiding attention from the outside world. As paramedics arrived and began treating Maria, Mark watched Shadow move between the children, checking on each one as if they were her own puppies. The dog's intelligence and dedication had not only led to their rescue, but had quite possibly saved their lives. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Maria's condition was critical. Mark couldn't help but marvel at how this stray dog, who had probably known her own share of hardship, had become a guardian angel for this desperate family. Shadow had somehow understood their need and had persisted until she found someone who would follow her to help. As paramedics rushed Maria to the hospital, Mark found himself facing another immediate crisis. The children couldn't stay in the abandoned house, but the city's emergency foster system was already overwhelmed. He watched them huddling together in the back of Sarah's patrol car, Shadow sitting protectively at their feet, and made a decision that would reshape his life. "I have space," he told Sarah, already dialing his landlord's number. "My apartment's not huge, but it's warm and safe, just until we figure something out." Sarah raised an eyebrow. She knew about Mark's tendency to take in strays, both human and animal, but she also knew his reputation at the shelter and his spotless background checks. "Let me make some calls," she said, stepping away to contact Child Protective Services. Meanwhile, Mark knelt beside the patrol car's open door, where Shadow watched him with those intelligent eyes. The dog hadn't left the children's side for a moment, even during the chaos of the paramedics' arrival. Miguel, the oldest, spoke up softly. "Shadow found us the first night we were here. She brought us a whole bag of hamburgers someone had thrown away. Then she just stayed, kept us warm at night, warned us when anyone came near the house." His voice cracked. "She's the reason Mama held on so long. She kept saying Shadow was a sign that angels were watching over us." The next few hours became a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and arrangements. Mark's landlord, Mr. Chen, initially balked at the idea of 5 children and a dog joining his tenant's already extensive menagerie. But when Mark explained the situation, there was a long pause on the phone. "My grandmother," Mr. Chen said finally, "came to America with nothing but 7 children and hope. Someone gave her a chance. The rent stays the same. Just keep the dog off the new carpet." The gruffness in his voice couldn't hide its tremor. By midnight, Mark's modest 2-bedroom apartment had transformed into an emergency shelter. His 3 cats watched from their perches as the children explored their temporary home, Shadow following close behind. The youngest, Anna, hadn't let go of the dog's fur since leaving the house. "You have so many books," Miguel exclaimed, examining Mark's overflowing bookshelf. The comment sparked something in Mark's memory. He had a friend who taught at the local elementary school. Another call, another piece falling into place. The night became a lesson in improvised problem-solving. Mark's neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, appeared with armfuls of her grandchildren's old clothes. The local pizza place, hearing the story from Sarah, donated enough food to feed an army. Even Mark's cats seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, allowing the children to pet them without their usual aloofness. But it was Shadow who proved to be the miracle worker. When Anna started crying for her mother, the dog gently pulled her into a game of fetch with an old tennis ball. When Lucas, the middle child, had a nightmare, Shadow was there before Mark could reach him, offering comfort with her presence. The dog seemed to know exactly what each child needed, exactly when they needed it. As Mark made up beds from couch, cushions and spare blankets, he watched Shadow moving from child to child, checking on each one like a diligent nurse. The dog's dedication made him think about the nature of family and protection. Here was an animal that had probably never known a stable home herself, yet she understood the fundamental need for safety and comfort. The next morning brought new challenges. Mark had to go to work at the shelter, but leaving 5 traumatized children alone wasn't an option. His boss, hearing the story, immediately offered a solution. Bring them to the shelter. "We've got space in the activity room," she said, "and God knows we could use some young energy around here." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What happened next was unexpected, but in retrospect, perfectly natural. The children, under Miguel's careful supervision, began helping at the shelter. They sorted donations, played with other children staying there, and shared their story with visitors. Their presence brought a new dimension to the shelter's work. Who better to understand the importance of sanctuary than those who had so recently needed it? Shadow became the shelter's unofficial therapy dog. She seemed to have a sixth sense for who needed comfort most. The dog who had once scrounged for food in dumpsters now sat patiently with homeless veterans as they filled out job applications, played gentle games with children living in the shelter, and somehow knew when someone just needed a quiet moment with a non-judgmental friend. The story of Shadow's rescue spread through local media, catching the attention of a prominent pet food company. They featured her in a campaign about the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals, donating a year's supply of food to the shelter's pet assistance program, which helped homeless pet owners keep their animal companions. But the real impact of Shadow's actions rippled out in quieter ways. Other shelters in the area began implementing pet-friendly policies, recognizing that many homeless individuals wouldn't seek help if it meant abandoning their animals. Local schools started bringing students to meet Shadow and learn about compassion and community service. The abandoned house where Maria and her children had hidden became the catalyst for a neighborhood renovation project. Maria's recovery in the hospital was slow but steady. Each day, Mark would bring the children to visit her, Shadow always in tow. The dog would lay her head gently on Maria's bed, those wise eyes watching over her healing process. The hospital. Staff, initially skeptical about allowing a former stray dog in the building, soon came to see Shadow as part of Maria's treatment plan. "Animals know," one nurse commented, watching Shadow comfort Maria after a particularly difficult therapy session. "They know who needs them and what needs to be done. We humans just have to be wise enough to follow their lead." The day Maria was released from the hospital marked another turning point. Mr. Chen, who had been quietly renovating a vacant ground-floor apartment in his building, offered it to Maria and her children at a reduced rent. "It has a small yard," he said, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "Good for a dog." Shadow's journey from stray to savior became a testament to the extraordinary capacity for love and intelligence that animals possess. Her story challenged people's assumptions about strays, about community, about what it means to be family. She had gone from scavenging on the streets to being a beacon of hope for an entire neighborhood. Local animal shelters reported increased adoption rates, particularly for older dogs like Shadow. People began to look at strays differently, seeing not just abandoned animals, but potential heroes waiting for their chance to make a difference. The local police department even started a program to train rescued dogs for community service work, naming Shadow as their inspiration. The transformation extended beyond the immediate community. Shadow's story caught the attention of animal behaviorists who began studying the remarkable way she had not only recognized a family in crisis, but had actively sought help. Her actions contributed to new research about animal intelligence and empathy, challenging long-held beliefs about the capabilities of dogs. But perhaps the most profound change was in how the experience transformed everyone involved. Mark, who had always tried to help others, learned that sometimes the best help comes from unexpected sources. Maria and her children found not just safety, but a whole community ready to support them. And Shadow, the stray who had once survived on scraps, discovered her true purpose as a bridge between those who needed help and those who could provide it. Shadow's impact on the community continued to grow in unexpected ways. One morning, as Mark walked her through the neighborhood, they encountered an elderly man sitting on his porch, shoulders slumped in defeat. Before Mark could react, Shadow gently pulled away and approached the man, placing her head on his knee with an understanding that seemed almost supernatural. The man, Harold Davis, had just received an eviction notice after living in his home for 40 years. His hands trembled as he showed Mark the paperwork. Shadow stayed by his side, her presence somehow making it easier for Harold to share his story. He had fallen behind on payments after his wife's medical bills depleted their savings, and now at 78 he faced homelessness. Mark immediately recognized an opportunity to expand the circle of help that Shadow had started. He contacted Sarah Martinez, who connected them with a legal aid organization specializing in senior housing rights. The lawyer discovered that Harold's loan had predatory terms, opening the door for a lawsuit that would eventually help not just Harold, but dozens of other seniors in similar situations. Harold's case became a rallying point for the community. Local contractors volunteered to repair his aging house, making it more energy efficient to reduce his bills. A financial advisor helped him restructure his debt. But it was Shadow who provided the daily emotional support he needed, visiting every morning as if she had appointed herself his personal guardian angel. The transformation in Harold sparked something larger. He had been a carpenter before retirement, and as he regained his confidence, he began teaching woodworking classes in his garage to local youth. Many were from troubled backgrounds, but under Harold's patient guidance and Shadow's watchful eye, they found purpose in creating beautiful things with their hands. One of these students was Miguel, Maria's oldest son, who showed a natural talent for the craft. Harold became a grandfather figure to him, teaching him not just about woodworking, but about resilience and dignity. Together, they started making furniture for families moving out of the shelter into new homes, creating a tangible symbol of fresh starts and community support. Shadow's presence during these workshops was remarkable. She seemed to know exactly which student needed encouragement, sometimes just sitting quietly beside them as they worked, other times initiating playful breaks when frustration built too high. The troubled teens who might have scoffed at human comfort found it easier to accept support from a dog who asked nothing but offered everything. The ripple effects continued to spread. A local business owner, inspired by Harold's woodworking program, started an apprenticeship initiative for shelter residents. Maria, recovering her strength, began organizing support groups for domestic violence survivors, with Shadow often curled up beside particularly distressed participants, offering silent comfort. Mark watched all this unfold with amazement, remembering that cold night when he had followed a barking dog to an abandoned house. Shadow had not just saved one family. She had sparked a movement of compassion that was transforming their entire community. Her actions reminded people that everyone, regardless of their circumstances, had something valuable to contribute. The shelter where Mark worked evolved too. They created a program called Shadow's Angels, pairing rescued dogs with families in crisis. The results were remarkable. The dogs, like Shadow, seemed to understand their role in healing traumatized individuals. They provided unconditional love and security to people rebuilding their lives while finding purpose and homes themselves. One particular case stood out. A teenage girl, Julie, had stopped speaking after escaping an abusive situation with her mother. Traditional therapy made little progress until she met a rescued pit bull named Max through the Shadow's Angels program. Like Shadow, Max had known hardship but maintained a gentle spirit. Slowly, Julie began to talk to Max, then about Max, and finally about her own experiences. The success stories multiplied. A veteran struggling with PTSD found his way back to society through working with rescue dogs. A group of former addicts started a dog walking service, finding purpose and community in caring for others. Each story was unique, but they all traced their inspiration back to Shadow's extraordinary act of compassion. Shadow's influence reached beyond direct service. Local schools developed programs teaching empathy and community responsibility through animal care. Business leaders, touched by the transformation in their community, created a fund to support innovative social programs. The abandoned houses that had once symbolized decay became renovation projects, turning neglected spaces into homes for families in transition. The media attention brought unexpected opportunities. A children's book author wrote Shadow's story, using it to teach young readers about compassion and community service. The book's success led to a series featuring other rescue dogs who had made extraordinary differences in people's lives. Shadow's story was teaching children nationwide that heroes come in all forms. But perhaps the most profound impact was on individual hearts and minds. People began to look at their neighbors differently, recognizing that everyone had the potential to help others, regardless of their own circumstances. The community learned that sometimes the most powerful solutions come from unexpected sources. Like a stray dog who refused to ignore suffering, Mark often reflected on how one act of kindness had multiplied exponentially. Shadow had shown that transformation doesn't always require grand gestures or substantial resources. Sometimes it just takes one being recognizing another's need and refusing to walk away. Her example challenged people to be more aware, more compassionate, more willing to step out of their comfort zones to help others. The local university's sociology department began studying what they called the shadow effect, how one animal's actions had catalyzed such significant community change. They found that the key lay not just in Shadow's initial rescue, but in how her continued presence inspired others to look beyond surface differences and recognize shared humanity. Shadow herself remained unchanged by her fame, continuing her daily rounds with the same gentle dedication. She still visited Harold's woodworking classes, accompanied Maria to support groups, and greeted shelter residents with tail wags and understanding eyes. Her consistency reminded everyone that true compassion isn't a one-time act, but a daily choice to show up for others. As winter returned to Detroit, marking a year since that fateful night, the neighborhood had transformed. Gardens bloomed where trash had accumulated. Children played safely on streets that had once been avoided. Neighbors knew each other's names and stories. And at the center of it all was a former stray dog who had taught an entire community about the extraordinary power of choosing to care. One snowy morning, as Mark and Shadow made their usual rounds through the neighborhood, they encountered something unexpected, a group of college students conducting interviews on the street. They were from the University of Michigan's School of Social Work, researching successful community revitalization programs. Shadow's story had drawn them here, but what they found was far more profound than they'd anticipated. The students set up a temporary research station in the community center where residents could share their experiences of the neighborhood's transformation. Shadow, ever intuitive, stationed herself by the door, greeting each person who came to tell their story. Her presence seemed to make it easier for people to open up, to share not just their successes, but their struggles and hopes. Among the visitors was a former gang member named Marcus. He'd been skeptical of all the changes. At first, viewing them as just another wave of do-gooders who would eventually abandon the neighborhood. But something about Shadow had caught his attention. He watched how she treated everyone the same, from the homeless man on the corner to the business executives who came to fund community projects. "That dog," Marcus told the researchers, "she taught me something about judgment. I used to size people up, put them in boxes, but Shadow, she just sees souls that need something. Could be food, could be love, could be purpose, and she gives what she can. Made me think about what I could give too." Marcus had started a youth mentoring program using his street experience to steer kids away from gangs. Shadow often accompanied him on his outreach walks, her presence diffusing tense situations and opening doors that might have remained closed to him alone. The program had already helped dozens of young people find alternatives to street life. The researchers were particularly interested in the economic impact of what they termed compassion-driven community development. Local businesses reported increased revenue as the neighborhood became safer and more vibrant. Property values had risen, but unlike typical gentrification, the original residents weren't being pushed out. Instead, they were becoming entrepreneurs and homeowners themselves. Maria's story became a central case study. She had transformed her experience into a successful catering business, employing other survivors of domestic violence. The business operated out of the shelter's industrial kitchen during off-hours, providing job training alongside income. Shadow had become the unofficial mascot, her presence helping new employees feel safe in their workplace. The study also revealed unexpected health benefits in the community. Dr. Sarah Chen, a local physician, reported decreased rates of stress-related illnesses among her patients. She attributed this partly to the increased social connections Shadow had inspired. People were looking out for each other, sharing resources, and creating support networks that reduced isolation and anxiety. Harold's woodworking program had expanded into a full-fledged vocational training center. Local unions partnered with him to create apprenticeship programs, offering paths to stable careers for people who might otherwise have been overlooked. Shadow still attended every class, somehow knowing when someone was close to giving up and needed encouragement. The researchers were particularly struck by the role of animals in the community's transformation. Following Shadow's example, many residents had adopted rescue pets, creating a network of animal-assisted support that operated informally but effectively. These pets provided emotional support to their owners while also strengthening neighborhood bonds through dog-walking groups and pet play dates. The shelter's Shadows Angels program had become a model for other cities. The researchers documented how the program's success went beyond just matching pets with people in need. It had created a ripple effect of responsibility and purpose. People who might have felt helpless in their own situations found strength in helping animals, which in turn helped them help others. One particularly moving case involved a homeless teenage boy named Alex. He'd been living in abandoned buildings, much like Maria's family had, when he encountered one of Shadow's angels, a three-legged pit bull named Hope. The dog's resilience, despite her disability, inspired Alex to seek help. Now, he worked at a local animal rescue, using his own experience to advocate for both homeless youth and abandoned animals. The university study captured how Shadow's influence had changed the very culture of the neighborhood. Children who once might have thrown rocks at stray animals now organized pet food drives. Elderly residents who had been afraid to leave their homes joined daily dog-walking groups, finding safety in numbers and friendship in shared purpose. Mark shared with the researchers how Shadow had transformed his own understanding of community service. Before Shadow, he explained, I thought helping meant providing services, food, shelter, counseling. But she showed me that sometimes the most important service is simply being present, recognizing someone's pain and staying with them through it. The research team was particularly impressed by the sustainable nature of the changes. Unlike many community improvement initiatives that depended on constant external funding, this transformation was powered by the residents themselves. Shadow had sparked something that had taken on a life of its own, with each person finding their own way to contribute to the whole. They documented how the community had developed its own support systems. When someone faced hardship, neighbors rallied together. Whether it was helping with home repairs, providing childcare, or simply offering companionship, people had learned to look out for each other. Shadow's example of unconditional support had become a community value. The study noted how this approach to community development challenged traditional models. Instead of imposing programs from above, change had grown organically from one simple act of compassion. Shadow had demonstrated that sometimes the most effective solutions come from within the community itself, from individuals choosing to care about each other. As the researchers concluded their study, they realized they had documented something more than just a successful community program. They had witnessed how one dog's actions had triggered a fundamental shift in how people viewed their relationships with each other and their capacity to make a difference. The university's findings would go on to influence social work and community development programs nationwide. Shadow's story became a case study in how small acts of compassion could catalyze lasting social change. But more importantly, it served as a reminder that everyone, regardless of their circumstances, had the power to transform their community for the better. The spring following the university study brought new challenges and opportunities to the community. A devastating storm swept through Detroit, causing widespread damage and flooding. But what could have been a catastrophic setback instead demonstrated how deeply the neighborhood's transformation had taken root. Shadow, as always, was at the forefront of the response. Before the city's emergency services could even fully mobilize, Shadow was already guiding Mark and other community members to elderly residents trapped by rising waters. Her acute senses and unwavering determination helped locate several people who might otherwise have been overlooked, including a bedridden veteran in a basement apartment. The community center where Harold taught his woodworking classes became an impromptu disaster relief headquarters. Shadow moved among the displaced families, providing comfort and somehow helping maintain a sense of calm in the chaos. Her presence seemed to remind everyone that they had weathered difficult times before and would do so again. Maria's catering business transformed into an emergency kitchen, feeding both displaced residents and relief workers. Her children, now confident and resourceful after their own journey from crisis to stability, organized other young people to deliver meals to those who couldn't reach the center. Shadow accompanied many of these deliveries, her presence making even the most distrustful residents willing to accept help. Marcus, the former gang member turned youth mentor, mobilized his network of reformed street kids into an emergency response team. They knew every alley and abandoned building in the neighborhood, knowledge that proved invaluable in reaching isolated residents. Shadow worked alongside them, her behavior helping the emergency responders understand which areas needed immediate attention. The storm's aftermath revealed something remarkable. While surrounding neighborhoods struggled with looting and disorder, this community pulled together. The trust and connections built over the past year, inspired by Shadow's example, proved stronger than the temptation to take advantage of the crisis. Instead, people shared resources, opened their homes to neighbors, and worked together to rebuild. Harold's woodworking students put their skills to immediate use, making emergency repairs to damaged homes. The program expanded to include basic construction training, with experienced contractors volunteering to teach flood mitigation techniques. Shadow supervised these efforts in her own way, seeming to understand the urgency of keeping people safely housed. The crisis also brought unexpected opportunities for growth. As news spread about the community's resilient response, city officials took notice. The mayor's office sent representatives to study how this neighborhood had developed such an effective grassroots emergency response system. Shadow's presence at these meetings, calm and attentive, seemed to remind everyone that the most powerful solutions often came from the ground up. Insurance companies proved reluctant to cover much of the storm damage, citing the neighborhood's high-risk status. But the community's lawyers, who had helped Harold save his home, took on the case pro bono. They argued that the neighborhood's demonstrated social cohesion and improved maintenance actually made it a lower risk than areas with higher property values but less community engagement. The case drew national attention, challenging traditional metrics for evaluating neighborhood stability. Shadow became a symbol of this challenge to conventional wisdom. How do you measure the value of a community where people look out for each other? How do you quantify the impact of relationships built on trust and mutual support? During the court proceedings, Shadow maintained her daily rounds, showing through action what the lawyers argued in words. She visited elderly residents checking on repairs, accompanied children to temporary schools set up in the community center, and seemed to understand that her calm presence helped maintain the community's morale. The university researchers returned, during this period, amazed to find their study of community transformation now included disaster resilience. They documented how the networks of support, inspired by Shadow's initial act of compassion, had created a framework for crisis response that no government agency could have planned. One researcher noted how Shadow's behavior during the crisis demonstrated an extraordinary level of emotional intelligence. The dog seemed to understand not just physical needs, but psychological ones. She spent extra time with children traumatized by the storm, waited patiently with elderly residents anxious about repairs, and somehow knew when relief workers needed a moment of comfort themselves. The crisis also revealed how deeply Shadow's influence had changed individual lives. Alex, the formerly homeless teen who now worked at the animal rescue, organized an emergency shelter for displaced pets. He understood from his own experience that forcing people to choose between their animals and safety could prevent them from seeking help. The insurance case eventually settled in the community's favor, setting a precedent for how neighborhood resilience could be measured. The settlement included funding for flood prevention infrastructure, but more importantly, it recognized the value of social capital in disaster recovery. Shadow's role in building this capital became part of the legal record. As the community rebuilt, they incorporated lessons learned from the crisis. New construction included features for flood resilience, but more importantly, they strengthened the social networks that had proved so crucial. Shadow's Angels expanded to include emergency response training, teaching other rescue dogs to assist in crisis situations. The experience changed how emergency services viewed community partnerships. The fire department started incorporating local knowledge into their response plans, recognizing that residents often knew best who needed help and how to reach them. Shadow's ability to guide rescuers to those in need became a model for training emergency response dogs. Perhaps most significantly, the crisis showed how true community resilience went beyond physical infrastructure. The emotional bonds Shadow had helped forge proved as important as any flood wall. People who might have been overwhelmed facing disaster alone found strength in connection and mutual support. Throughout the rebuilding process, Shadow maintained a gentle presence, reminding everyone through her actions that compassion and patience were as essential as hammers and nails. Her unwavering dedication to her community demonstrated that the strongest foundations are built not of concrete, but of relationships. The storm and its aftermath added a new chapter to Shadow's legacy, showing how one act of compassion could create ripples that helped an entire community weather any storm. She had not only saved lives in the immediate crisis, but had helped build the kind of community that saved itself. As summer approached, the neighborhood's recovery from the storm brought an unexpected opportunity. A prestigious documentary film crew arrived, intending to capture the story of this remarkable community transformation. They had heard about Shadow's initial rescue and the subsequent changes, but what they discovered was far more profound than they'd anticipated. The filmmakers began by interviewing Mark about that fateful winter night, but Shadow's persistent tugging at the camera operator's sleeve led them to a more immediate story. She guided them to a small house where a young woman named Grace sat, alone on her porch, clearly distressed. What unfolded before their cameras was Shadow's gift in action. Grace, they learned, was a promising artist who had lost her studio in the storm. More devastating than the physical loss was the destruction of years of work, paintings that represented her journey from addiction to recovery. Shadow's attention that day wasn't just comfort, it sparked a chain of events that would transform not only Grace's life, but the community's approach to healing through art. Harold's woodworking space had survived the storm largely intact. Inspired by Grace's situation, he offered her a corner of his workshop to restart her art. The documentary crew captured the moment when Grace first walked into the space, Shadow trotting beside her with an encouraging wag. What began as a temporary solution evolved into something extraordinary. The combination of woodworking and art students created an unexpected synergy. Young people learning carpentry began incorporating artistic elements into their work, while Grace's art took on new dimensions as she experimented with mixed media, including wood. Shadow moved between the two groups, her presence somehow bridging any initial awkwardness. The documentary team found themselves witnessing the birth of what would become the neighborhood's Arts and Skills Center. Grace began offering art therapy sessions, particularly helping children process their trauma from the storm through creativity. Shadow's presence during these sessions proved remarkably effective, especially with children too overwhelmed to express their feelings verbally. Maria's teenage daughter, Isabella, discovered a talent for photography through the new programs. She began documenting the neighborhood's ongoing transformation, capturing moments of connection and healing that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Her photos of Shadow working with various community members became powerful testimonies to the dog's continuing impact. The film crew's presence attracted attention from urban development experts who saw something revolutionary in the community's approach. Traditional development focused on infrastructure and economics, but here was a model that put relationships and healing at the center. Shadow had inadvertently inspired a new paradigm for community renewal. Local businesses began sponsoring art and vocational programs at the center. They recognized that investing in the community's creative and emotional well-being produced tangible economic benefits. Shadow's Angels expanded to include art therapy dogs, specially trained to assist during creative sessions. The documentary captured a particularly moving scene when Grace organized an exhibition of work created at the center. The pieces told stories of recovery, resilience, and connection. Shadow attended the opening, somehow knowing to guide visitors to artists who seemed nervous about sharing their work. Her presence helped turn anxiety into pride. Marcus's youth mentoring program found a new dimension through the arts. Young people who struggled with traditional education flourished when given creative outlets alongside vocational training. Shadow's calm presence during these sessions helped maintain an atmosphere of safety and acceptance that allowed creativity to flourish. The filmmakers also documented the ripple effects beyond the neighborhood. Other communities began sending representatives to learn from this model of integrated recovery. They were particularly interested in how the combination of practical skills, artistic expression, and animal-assisted therapy had created such sustainable change. One memorable scene showed a group of civic leaders from another city observing a session where younger children taught senior citizens to use digital art tools. Shadow moved between the generations, her gentle presence helping bridge any technological frustration with patience and humor. The scene perfectly captured how the community had learned to value every member's contribution. The documentary team was particularly struck by the way Shadow's influence had evolved. While she had started as a rescue dog who saved one family, she had become a living example of how to build connections across traditional barriers. Her actions demonstrated daily that compassion and creativity were essential elements of community healing. Grace's art therapy program expanded to include working with veterans dealing with PTSD. The combination of creative expression and Shadow's calming presence proved remarkably effective. One veteran, who hadn't spoken about his experiences in years, found his voice through painting alongside the patient dog. The film captured how the Arts and Skills Center became a model for trauma-informed community development. Shadow's intuitive understanding of when someone needed space or support helped shape how the programs were structured. The approach recognized that healing happened not just through formal therapy, but through creative expression and meaningful connection. Isabella's photography project evolved into a youth media program, teaching young people to document their community's story. Shadow often appeared in their work, not as the focus, but as a steady presence supporting moments of transformation. The young photographers learned to capture not just images, but the spirit of connection that had transformed their neighborhood. The documentary makers found themselves recording something rare, a community that had found ways to heal itself through creativity, skill sharing, and compassion. Shadow's example had shown that recovery wasn't just about rebuilding structures, but about nurturing the connections that make a community resilient. As filming concluded, the crew captured a scene that encapsulated the community's transformation. At sunset, residents gathered for an outdoor exhibition combining woodwork, art, and photography. Shadow moved through the crowd, greeting old friends and making new ones. Her presence a reminder of how far they had come from that cold winter night when she first led Mark to an abandoned house. The documentary would go on to win several awards, but its greatest impact was in challenging conventional wisdom about community development. It showed that the most powerful changes come not from top-down programs, but from nurturing the connections and creativity that allow communities to heal themselves. Shadow's legacy had grown from saving one family to inspiring a model of community transformation that combined practical skills, creative expression, and compassionate connection. Her story reminded viewers that sometimes the most profound changes start with simply paying attention to those in need and having the courage to respond with love. The documentary's success brought unexpected challenges and opportunities to the community. One morning, as Shadow accompanied Mark on their daily rounds, they encountered a group of real estate developers surveying the neighborhood. Their sleek suits and calculated gazes seemed out of place in the warmth of the community, but Shadow approached them with her usual openness. The developers had seen the documentary and recognized a lucrative opportunity. They proposed a massive redevelopment project, luxury apartments, high-end retail spaces, and an upscale arts district. On paper, it looked like progress, but Shadow's reaction was telling. She stood between the developers and Harold's woodworking center, her posture protective rather than aggressive. Mark remembered Shadow's first act of protection, leading him to Maria's family in that abandoned house. Now she seemed to sense a different kind of threat to her community. The developers' plans would price out the very people who had rebuilt this neighborhood with their bare hands and hearts. Grace, whose art therapy programs had become vital to the community's healing, organized a meeting at the Arts and Skills Center. Shadow sat attentively as residents shared their concerns. The dog's presence helped keep the discussion focused and constructive, even as emotions ran high. Maria spoke about her journey from hiding in an abandoned house to running a successful catering business. "This neighborhood didn't just give us shelter," she said, Shadow's head resting supportively on her knee. "It gave us a chance to rebuild our lives with dignity. We can't let that opportunity be taken from others who need it." Isabella, now an accomplished young photographer, presented a powerful series of images documenting the community's transformation. Shadow appeared in many photos, not as the subject but as a steady presence supporting moments of change. The images showed something the developers' glossy renderings couldn't capture: the soul of a community. Marcus, drawing on his street experience and newfound role as a youth mentor, proposed an alternative. Instead of pushing people out, He suggested, "Let's show these developers how to build something that benefits everyone." Shadow's tail wagged as if approving his diplomatic approach. What emerged was a revolutionary concept in urban development. The community proposed a partnership that would preserve the neighborhood's character while allowing for sustainable growth. Harold's woodworking students would be involved in the construction. Grace's art therapy programs would expand into new spaces. Shadow's angels would establish a permanent training center for therapy dogs. The developers, initially skeptical, were moved by the community's presentation. One of them, James Chen, no relation to Mr. Chen the landlord, revealed that he had grown up in a neighborhood similar to this one before gentrification displaced his family. Shadow seemed to sense something in him, staying close as he shared his story. The resulting collaboration became a model for equitable urban development. Instead of luxury condos, they designed mixed-income housing that included spaces for community programs. The retail plans were modified to prioritize local businesses like Maria's catering company and Grace's art studio. Shadow's influence on the project was subtle but significant. The developers noticed how she created connections between people and incorporated this principle into their designs. They included communal spaces, gardens, and areas where residents could gather and support each other, just as they had learned to do. The construction process itself became a community endeavor. Harold's woodworking program expanded into a full-scale construction training initiative. Young people who might have been displaced by traditional development instead found careers building their own community's future. Grace worked with architects to ensure the new buildings included therapeutic spaces, art studios, counseling rooms, and quiet areas where Shadow's angels could work with residents. The dog's intuitive understanding of human needs influenced the very structure of the buildings. Isabella documented the transformation, her photographs capturing not just physical changes, but the preservation of human connections. Shadow appeared in many shots, still making her daily rounds, still bringing people together, still showing that progress doesn't have to mean losing what matters most. The project attracted attention from urban planners worldwide. They came to study how this neighborhood had managed to grow without displacing its residents. Shadow's presence during their visits seemed to help them understand that development should serve the community, not the other way around. Maria's children, now young adults, became ambassadors for the project. They spoke at planning meetings and universities about their journey from that abandoned house to being active participants in their community's future. Shadow attended these presentations, her presence a reminder of how their story began. The developers learned valuable lessons about community engagement. James Chen became an advocate for ethical development practices, often citing Shadow's example of how building trust and connections was as important as building structures. The Art and Skills Center expanded into a new facility that combined vocational training, therapy programs, and community spaces. Shadow supervised the construction daily, seeming to understand that this building represented the physical manifestation of everything the community had learned about healing and growth. As new residents moved into the completed buildings, Shadow helped integrate them into the community. She seemed to know which newcomers needed an introduction to long-time residents, which ones might benefit from Grace's art therapy, or which children might enjoy Harold's woodworking classes. The project's success challenged conventional wisdom about urban development. It proved that growth didn't have to mean gentrification, that progress didn't have to erase history, and that the strongest communities are built on relationships rather than real estate values. Throughout the development process, Shadow maintained her original mission, finding those who needed help and bringing them into the community's circle of support. She showed that while buildings might change, the essence of a community lies in its capacity for compassion and connection. The neighborhood became a living testament to what's possible when development serves human needs rather than just market forces. Shadow's legacy expanded once again, from saving a family to inspiring a community, to now influencing how cities themselves could grow while preserving their soul. As autumn painted the neighborhood in vibrant colors, Shadow's influence continued to evolve in unexpected ways. A renowned neurologist, Dr. Rebecca Zhang, arrived at the community center one morning, drawn by reports of extraordinary behavioral changes in trauma survivors who had interacted with Shadow. What began as a casual observation soon developed into a groundbreaking study that would change how science understood the healing power of human-animal connections. Dr. Zhang had initially planned a brief visit, but Shadow's interaction with a young boy stopped her in her tracks. The child, a recent refugee who hadn't spoken since witnessing violence in his homeland, was sitting alone in the center's garden. Shadow approached him differently than she did others, moving slowly, maintaining a slight distance, letting the boy make the first move. Over the next hour, Dr. Zhang watched in amazement as Shadow orchestrated what she would later describe as a masterclass in trauma-informed care. The dog somehow knew exactly when to move closer, when to back away, when to simply be still. By the end of the session, the boy had reached out to touch Shadow's fur, his first voluntary interaction in months. This observation sparked a comprehensive research project that would span 2 years. Dr. Zhang assembled a team of specialists, including psychologists, animal behaviorists, and neuroscientists. They began documenting Shadow's interactions with various community members, particularly those dealing with trauma, depression, or anxiety. The research revealed something extraordinary. Shadow appeared to have an innate ability to identify and respond to different types of emotional distress. Her behavior changed subtly, depending on whether someone was experiencing anxiety, depression, or trauma responses. Even more remarkably, her interventions seemed to help regulate people's nervous systems. Grace's art therapy program became a key part of the study. Researchers observed how Shadow's presence during therapy sessions created what they termed a safe container for emotional expression. Participants showed significantly lower stress markers when Shadow was present, enabling them to process trauma through art more effectively. The study expanded to include Shadow's work with Marcus's youth program. The researchers discovered that teenagers who had previously shown aggressive tendencies demonstrated marked improvements in emotional regulation after regular interactions with Shadow. The dog seemed to model a form of strength that didn't require dominance or violence. Maria's oldest son, Miguel, now studying psychology in college, became involved in the research. His unique perspective as someone who had experienced Shadow's healing presence firsthand added valuable insights to the study. He helped develop new protocols for integrating animal-assisted therapy into trauma recovery programs. The research team was particularly intrigued by Shadow's work with Harold's woodworking students. They observed how her presence helped participants maintain focus and calm during challenging tasks. Brain scans showed decreased activity in areas associated with stress and increased activity in regions linked to learning and emotional regulation when shadow was present. Dr. Zhang's findings began attracting attention from medical institutions worldwide. The research suggested that animals like shadow could play a crucial role in treating conditions that had traditionally been challenging to address through conventional therapy alone. Shadow's natural abilities were helping reshape understanding of emotional healing. The community center established a dedicated research wing where professionals could study and learn from Shadow's techniques. The dog seemed to understand the importance of her role, patiently demonstrating her skills with different individuals while allowing researchers to document her methods. One breakthrough came when studying Shadow's work with veterans suffering from PTSD. The dog displayed an uncanny ability to anticipate anxiety attacks before they occurred, often positioning herself next to veterans moments before they experienced flashbacks. This early warning system helped many veterans develop better coping strategies. Isabella's photography skills proved invaluable to the research, capturing subtle behavioral cues that might otherwise have been missed. Her images documented Shadow's minute responses to different emotional states, slight changes in ear position, tail height, or body posture that corresponded to specific therapeutic needs. The research led to the development of new training protocols for therapy dogs. While no other dog could exactly replicate Shadow's intuitive abilities, her example helped trainers identify and nurture similar capabilities in other animals. The Shadow Protocol became a standard in animal-assisted therapy programs. Dr. Zhang's team also studied how Shadow's presence affected group dynamics. They observed that in community meetings or therapy sessions, her subtle movements between participants often helped regulate emotional tensions and facilitate more productive discussions. The impact of the research extended beyond therapeutic applications. Architects consulted the findings when designing healthcare facilities, incorporating spaces specifically designed for animal-assisted therapy. Urban planners began considering how to create environments that supported the kind of healing connections Shadow facilitated. Throughout the study, Shadow maintained her regular duties in the community. She continued her daily rounds, worked with Grace's art therapy sessions, supervised Harold's woodworking classes, and supported Marcus's youth program. The research simply documented what the community had already known, that Shadow's presence catalyzed healing in profound ways. The study's findings were published in several prestigious medical journals, legitimizing what many had experienced. Anecdotally, Shadow's work provided scientific evidence for the deep connection between emotional well-being and human-animal bonds, changing how mainstream medicine viewed animal-assisted therapy. As the research concluded, Dr. Zhang noted that Shadow's greatest contribution might be in demonstrating how healing happens through relationship rather than intervention. The dog's natural ability to create safe spaces for emotional processing offered a model for trauma-informed care that extended far beyond animal-assisted therapy. The legacy of the research continued to grow as other communities began implementing programs based on the study's findings. Shadow had not only helped heal her immediate community, but had contributed to a broader understanding of how to support emotional healing and resilience. The winter following Dr. Zhang's research brought an unexpected visitor to the community, a Silicon Valley tech entrepreneur named Sarah Chen. Again, no relation to Mr. Chen. She arrived unannounced one morning, drawn by both the documentary and the groundbreaking research. What caught her attention wasn't just Shadow's remarkable abilities, but how the community had integrated technology and compassion in their recovery. Sarah had been developing artificial intelligence systems designed to predict and prevent urban crises. But watching Shadow interact with community members, she realized her algorithms were missing something crucial, the human element that made Shadow's interventions so effective. Her visit coincided with an important milestone in the community. Isabella, now heading the youth media program, had launched a digital platform that connected residents who needed help with those who could provide it. The system was elegant in its simplicity, inspired by Shadow's intuitive way of matching needs with resources. Sarah spent days observing how the community functioned, particularly fascinated by the intersection of Shadow's natural abilities and the emerging digital infrastructure. The dog still made her daily rounds, but now her insights were being augmented by technology that helped extend her impact beyond her physical presence. Grace's art therapy program had evolved to include virtual sessions, reaching trauma survivors who couldn't attend in person. During these sessions, Shadow's presence was felt even through screens, her calming effect somehow transcending the digital divide. This observation sparked an idea in Sarah's mind. Working with Isabella and Miguel, Sarah began developing what they called the Shadow System, an AI platform that incorporated the principles behind Shadow's intuitive understanding of human needs. The system analyzed patterns of community, interaction, identifying potential connections and support networks that might otherwise go unnoticed. The technology didn't try to replace the human-animal connection that made Shadow's work so special. Instead, it amplified her impact by helping coordinate community resources more effectively. When Shadow identified someone in need, the system could quickly mobilize the right kind of support. Marcus's youth program became an early testing ground for the new technology. The system helped track the subtle indicators of youth at risk, much like Shadow seemed to know who needed intervention. But crucially, it empowered human mentors to provide the personal connection that Shadow had shown was essential for real change. Harold's Woodworking Center integrated the technology to match students with projects that aligned with their healing journey. The system, learning from Shadow's example, considered not just skill levels, but emotional readiness and potential. Therapeutic benefits of different types of work. Maria's catering business used the platform to coordinate meal deliveries to homebound residents, something Shadow had often helped with. The technology helped scale this service, ensuring that no one in the community went hungry while maintaining the personal touch that made Shadow's visits so special. The Shadow System soon attracted attention from other communities facing similar challenges. Sarah worked to ensure the technology remained true to its inspiration. It was designed to enhance human connection, not replace it. Every feature was evaluated against the question, would Shadow approve? Dr. Zhang's research team returned to study this unique integration of animal intuition and artificial intelligence. They found that communities using the system showed improved resilience and stronger social bonds, particularly when the technology was paired with programs similar to Shadow's Angels. The platform evolved to include a feature called Shadows, Wisdom, an AI-driven system that helped train therapy dogs and their handlers. By analyzing thousands of hours of Shadows interactions, the system helped other dogs develop similar capabilities for emotional support and community building. Isabella's photography project expanded into a digital archive, documenting the community's ongoing transformation. The AI system helped identify patterns in these images, revealing insights about how community healing happened and helping other neighborhoods learn from their experience. One particularly innovative application emerged in the field of urban planning. The shadow system began analyzing community interaction patterns to inform design decisions. Parks, community spaces, and even building layouts were optimized to encourage the kind of organic connections that shadow naturally facilitated. The technology also helped address one of Mark's longtime concerns: how to ensure Shadow's legacy would continue beyond her own lifetime. The system captured not just her methods, but the underlying principles that made her work so effective, ensuring future generations could build on her approach to community healing. Throughout this technological evolution, Shadow remained her usual self, seemingly unimpressed by the computers and algorithms inspired by her work. She continued her daily rounds, offering the direct personal connection that no technology could replicate. Her actions reminded everyone that while technology could amplify compassion, it couldn't replace it. Sarah worked to ensure the platform remained open source and accessible to communities that needed it most. She established a foundation to provide grants for implementing the system, with priority given to neighborhoods facing challenges similar to what Shadow's community had overcome. The integration of Shadow's natural wisdom with emerging technology created a new model for community development. It showed how the best innovations often come from observing and amplifying what already works in nature and human relationships, rather than trying to replace them. As winter turned to spring, the shadow system had been implemented in dozens of communities worldwide. Each adaptation was unique, shaped by local needs and culture, but all were guided by the principles Shadow had demonstrated: that healing happens through connection, that everyone has something to contribute, and that sometimes the most powerful solutions come from the heart rather than algorithms. The technology became a tool for spreading Shadow's influence far beyond what one dog could physically achieve. But in her own community, she remained focused on the individual connections that had started it all. Still leading Mark to those who needed help, still comforting children in Grace's art therapy sessions, still showing that the most powerful technology is love in action. As spring blossomed in Detroit, Shadow's influence took an unexpected turn into the world of education. A progressive education expert, Dr. James Anderson, visited the community after hearing about the intersection of Shadow's work with the technology platform. What he witnessed inspired him to reimagine how schools could nurture not just academic growth, but emotional and social development as well. The community's youth center had already become an informal learning lab where traditional education merged with Shadow's approach to healing and growth. Children who struggled in conventional classrooms thrived in this environment where emotional safety came first. Shadow's presence during learning sessions seemed to unlock potential that standard teaching methods couldn't reach. Dr. Anderson observed how Shadow instinctively identified children who needed different approaches to learning. Some needed physical movement to focus. Others required quiet spaces for concentration. The dog would guide students to environments that suited their learning styles, something the shadow system technology had begun to analyze and document. Maria's youngest son, who had once been too traumatized to speak in his traditional school, was now leading peer tutoring sessions. He credited his transformation to Shadow's patient presence during his early days in the community. The dog had shown him that it was safe to be vulnerable, to make mistakes, and to learn at his own pace. Grace's art therapy program evolved into a full-fledged alternative education initiative. Students who couldn't express themselves through traditional academics found their voice through creative projects. Shadow would sit with struggling students, her calm presence helping them push through frustration to discovery. The Woodworking Center became a place where mathematics and physics came alive through practical application. Harold's students learned geometry while building furniture, economics while running their small business, and chemistry while working with finishes and materials. Shadow supervised these sessions, somehow knowing when to guide students to take breaks or persist through challenges. Marcus's youth program incorporated elements of social justice education, teaching young people about community organizing and civic responsibility through real-world projects. Shadow attended these sessions, her behavior modeling the kind of peaceful strength that made positive change possible. Dr. Anderson worked with the community to develop what they called the Shadow Education Model. This approach recognized that learning happens best in environments where students feel emotionally safe and personally valued. The model incorporated elements of trauma-informed teaching, project-based learning, and social-emotional development. Isabella's media program became a cornerstone of this new educational approach. Students learned technical skills while documenting their community's story, developing critical thinking abilities while analyzing social issues, and building communication skills while sharing their work with the world. Shadow's presence in their photographs and videos added a layer of emotional authenticity that made their work particularly powerful. The shadow system technology adapted to support this educational innovation. It helped teachers identify learning patterns, suggest personalized approaches for different students, and track progress in ways that went beyond traditional metrics. But crucially, it remained a tool in service of human connection, never a replacement for it. Sarah Chen's foundation provided funding to pilot the shadow education model in other communities. The results were remarkable. Schools that adopted the approach saw improvements not just in academic performance, but in student well-being, community engagement, and social cohesion. Universities began studying the model, particularly interested in how it integrated emotional healing with academic learning. Shadow's intuitive approach to supporting students became the subject of doctoral dissertations and research papers, contributing to a growing body of evidence about the connection between emotional safety and effective learning. The community center established a teacher training program where educators from around the world could learn from Shadow's example. They observed how the dog created an atmosphere of unconditional acceptance that allowed learning to flourish, and how this principle could be applied in any educational setting. One particularly moving success story involved a group of teenage refugees who had arrived in the community with interrupted education and significant trauma. Through the shadow education model, they not only caught up academically, but became leaders in their peer groups, helping other newcomers navigate both learning and healing. Dr. Anderson documented how Shadow's influence extended beyond individual student success to transform entire school cultures. Classes that implemented the model saw reduced bullying, increased cooperation, and stronger connections between students, teachers, and families. The approach proved particularly effective with students who had been labeled as difficult or unteachable in traditional settings. Something about the combination of emotional safety, practical learning, and community connection helped these students discover their own potential. Mark noticed how Shadow seemed to understand the importance of this educational evolution. She spent more time at the learning centers, moving between students with purpose, her presence a reminder that education was about growing as a whole person, not just accumulating knowledge. The Shadow education model began influencing policy discussions about school reform. It demonstrated that addressing students' emotional and social needs wasn't just a nice addition to academic instruction. It was fundamental to effective learning. As summer approached, the community hosted its first educational conference, sharing their model with teachers and administrators from around the country. Shadow attended every session, her behavior continuing to teach lessons about patience, acceptance, and the power of unconditional support. The legacy of this educational transformation extended far beyond academic achievement. It showed that when learning environments honor the whole person, emotions, experiences, and potential, they create not just better students, but stronger communities. Through it all, Shadow maintained her original mission of connecting with those who needed support, showing that sometimes the most powerful teaching happens not through words or technology, but through presence and love. As summer reached its peak, Shadow's journey took an extraordinary turn when a United Nations representative visited the community. Ambassador Elena Rodriguez had heard about the remarkable transformation of this Detroit neighborhood and how a single dog had catalyzed changes that now influenced communities worldwide. Her visit would open a new chapter in Shadow's legacy, one that would touch lives across continents. The ambassador arrived during one of Grace's international art therapy sessions, where trauma survivors from various conflict zones connected virtually with the community's healing programs. Shadow's presence, even through a screen, seemed to transcend language barriers. The dog's calming influence helped participants from Syria, Ukraine, and South Sudan find common ground in their healing journey. Maria's catering business had evolved into a culinary diplomacy program, teaching cooking skills to refugees while preserving their cultural heritage. Shadow attended these sessions, somehow understanding that food preparation was about more than sustenance. It was about maintaining connections to home while building new ones. Ambassador Rodriguez was particularly moved by how the Shadow system technology had been adapted to support refugee integration in various countries. The platform helped match newcomers with resources and opportunities, while maintaining the personal touch that Shadow had shown was essential for true community building. Marcus's youth program had developed an international exchange component, connecting young people from different conflict zones to share their experiences and work together on peace-building initiatives. Shadow's approach to conflict resolution, patient, non-threatening but persistent, became a model for these youth leaders. The Woodworking Center had started a global artisan network where Harold students collaborated with craftspeople from indigenous communities worldwide. Shadow supervised these cross-cultural exchanges, her presence somehow helping bridge gaps that language couldn't span. Isabella's media program now included young journalists from around the world, documenting stories of community transformation in their own countries. Shadow's influence appeared in their work. They learned to look for the quiet moments of connection that often held the most powerful stories. The ambassador witnessed how the shadow education model had been adapted for use in refugee camps and conflict zones. Teachers reported that incorporating Shadow's principles of emotional safety and unconditional acceptance helped students overcome trauma and engage with learning. During her visit, a group of international peace workers arrived to study the community's approach to conflict resolution. They observed how Shadow's method of gentle persistence and unwavering presence had created a model for building trust between divided communities. Dr. Zhang's research team had expanded their study to include similar community transformation initiatives worldwide. They found that while each situation was unique, the principles Shadow had demonstrated, patience, presence, and unconditional support, were universally effective in healing community trauma. The Shadow system technology had been adapted to support humanitarian efforts in crisis zones. Aid workers used it to coordinate resources and identify needs, while maintaining the human connection that Shadow had shown was crucial for effective support. Zera Chen's foundation established a global network of community healers, each applying Shadow's principles in their own cultural context. The dog's approach to building trust and fostering connection proved adaptable to vastly different societies and situations. The community center began hosting international delegations who came to learn from their experience. Shadow attended these sessions, her behavior continuing to demonstrate that the most profound changes often start with simple acts of compassion. One particularly powerful moment came when a group of former child soldiers from different conflicts met at the center. Shadow seemed to understand the weight of their experiences, approaching each one with gentle respect. Her presence helped create a safe space for them to begin sharing their stories. The ambassador was struck by how Shadow's influence had created a new model for international development, one that prioritized emotional healing and community connections alongside economic growth. This approach challenged traditional metrics of progress, suggesting that true development must nurture the human spirit. Mark watched as Shadow's simple act of leading him to an abandoned house that winter night had grown into a global movement. The dog's intuitive understanding of human needs had helped create a framework for healing that transcended cultural and national boundaries. Grace's art therapy programs now included virtual galleries where trauma survivors from around the world shared their healing journeys through creative expression. Shadow's presence in these spaces helped maintain the sense of safety that made such vulnerability possible. The international impact of Shadow's work led to the creation of a new UN initiative focused on community-led healing in post-conflict zones. The program incorporated the principles Shadow had demonstrated, that sustainable peace requires more than policy changes. It needs nurturing spaces where trust can grow. Through all this global attention, Shadow remained focused on her daily rounds in her own community. She continued to find those who needed help, to comfort those in pain, and to show through her actions that love knows no boundaries, geographical or otherwise. The ambassador's visit concluded with a remarkable ceremony where Shadow received a special UN recognition for contributions to peace and healing. The dog accepted the honor with her usual humility, more interested in comforting a nervous child in the audience than in the formal proceedings. This recognition helped secure funding for similar initiatives worldwide, ensuring that Shadow's approach to community healing could reach those who needed it most. Her legacy had grown from saving one family to inspiring a global movement for compassionate community development. As winter returned to Detroit, marking 2 years since Shadow first led Mark to that abandoned house, the community gathered for a special celebration. But this wasn't just any anniversary. It was a moment to reflect on how one dog's compassion had sparked a movement that had transformed countless lives across the globe. The celebration took place in the newly completed community plaza, a space designed using principles inspired by Shadow's intuitive understanding of human connection. The plaza featured healing gardens, art installations created by Grace's students, and quiet corners where people could find solace, just as Shadow had always known when someone needed space. Maria's family, now prosperous business owners and community leaders, shared their story of transformation. The abandoned house where Shadow had found them had been preserved and converted into a museum of community healing, its rooms telling stories of hope and renewal from around the world. Harold's woodworking students had crafted beautiful benches throughout the plaza, each one inscribed with stories of lives touched by Shadow's influence. The elderly craftsman, now in his 80s, still taught daily classes, with Shadow faithfully by his side, helping new generations find purpose through creativity. Marcus stood before the gathering, his former gang members, now community peacekeepers, and spoke about how Shadow had shown them a different kind of strength. The youth program he led had become a model for violence prevention worldwide, teaching young people that true power comes from protecting and uplifting others. Isabella's photographs lined the plaza walls, capturing Shadow's journey from rescue dog to global inspiration. Each image told a story of transformation. The frightened refugee child finding their voice, the veteran healing through art, the former adversaries becoming friends. Shadow's presence in each photo reminded everyone that change starts with connection. The Shadow System technology had evolved into a global network, supporting community healing initiatives on every continent. Sarah Chen spoke about how Shadow's intuitive wisdom had helped create artificial intelligence that enhanced, rather than replaced, human connection, showing that technology could amplify compassion. Dr. Zhang presented her latest research findings, demonstrating how communities that adopted Shadow's principles showed measurable improvements in mental health, social cohesion, and economic stability. The dog's approach to healing had revolutionized trauma recovery practices worldwide. Grace's art therapy program had grown into an international movement, with similar programs in conflict zones and refugee camps around the globe. Her students' artwork decorated the plaza, each piece telling a story of healing and hope inspired by Shadow's unwavering support. The UN ambassador returned for the celebration, announcing the establishment of the Shadow Institute for Community Healing, a global center dedicated to studying and spreading the principles Shadow had demonstrated. The institute would ensure that future generations could learn from her example. Mark watched it all with amazement, remembering that cold night when he'd followed a barking dog into the darkness. Shadow sat beside him, still more interested in checking on anyone who seemed distressed than in the accolades being showered upon her. As twilight approached, the community gathered for a candlelight ceremony. Each person held a light representing a life touched by Shadow's compassion. The plaza glowed with thousands of flames, each one a testament to the power of unconditional love to transform lives. Shadow moved through the crowd, still doing what she had always done, finding those who needed comfort, bringing people together, showing through her actions that the greatest impact often comes from the simplest acts of kindness. The celebration concluded with the unveiling of a simple statue, not of Shadow herself, but of an empty doorway. Below it, a plaque read, "Sometimes the greatest acts of courage are simply opening doors for others to walk through." Shadow showed us the way. As the community dispersed, Shadow led Mark on one final round of the neighborhood. They passed the arts center where Grace still taught, the woodworking shop where Harold's students learned life skills alongside their craft, and the community kitchen where Maria's family helped newcomers find their footing. They stopped at the preserved abandoned house where it had all begun. Shadow sat for a moment, looking up at the building that had once sheltered a desperate family. In the window, a light burned, a reminder that hope can be found in the darkest places if someone cares enough to look. The night ended as it had begun 2 years ago, with Shadow leading the way. But now, instead of leading to those who needed help, she was showing a path forward for all those who wanted to help others. Her legacy would continue through every life she had touched, every community she had inspired, and every heart she had opened to the possibility of transformation through compassion. The story of a stray dog who led a man to an abandoned house had become a blueprint for global change. Shadow had shown that the most profound transformations often start with the simplest acts of kindness, and that one being's compassion can ripple out to touch the world. As Mark and Shadow walked home under the stars, the dog's mission remained unchanged: to find those who needed help and bring them into the circle of care. Her methods had been studied, her influence had spread worldwide, but her heart remained as simple and true as on that first winter night when she had decided that no one should suffer alone in the darkness. The lights of the community glowed warmly around them, each one representing a story of healing, hope, and renewal. Shadow had shown that sometimes the greatest heroes are those who simply choose to care, and that love, expressed through action, has the power to transform the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.